I'm quite shocked still that the one word that hasn't been mentioned much during this election is the Brexit word. I think that was the greatest act of national harm that this country's probably done for a century.
Well, in a minute, we're going to be speaking to the Conservative peer, Lord Stuart Rose. But first, let's hear from Times Radio senior political correspondent Patrick Maguire, who joins me in the studio now. Patrick, it's been a funny old day on the campaign trail, hasn't it? No sort of key story emerging, but this story about the betting scandal isn't going away.
It really isn't, Cathy. And I think the most significant thing the Prime Minister has said on that front today is that when asked whether he could guarantee no cabinet minister had placed a bet on the date of the election, he did not deny that. Now, we already know from Conservative campaign headquarters that a small number of individuals who've been identified as having placed bets on the election. We know about Rishi Sunak's close protection officer. We know about Laura Saunders and Craig Williams, the Conservative candidates. And we know about Tony Lee, the party's director of campaigns and husband of Miss Saunders. But we don't yet know whether any frontline politicians have placed those bets. That Rishi Sunak hasn't ruled it out will definitely set hairs running.
I mean, it's just sort of beggars belief, doesn't it? You had the launch in the rain, you had the D-Day fiasco, and now you've got this betting scandal. I mean, it's farcical, isn't it?
It is, and the risk of the betting scandal is it's a sort of Partygate redux in that it pushes all the same buttons that people feel about politics, and indeed of politics as a whole, not just the Conservative Party, but it's a particular risk for the party of Partygate, the feeling that politicians are on the take, that they are enriching themselves from the information they gain in public service. It's really damaging for Rishi Sunak, particularly given his reluctance anyway to distance himself from the mistakes of his predecessors. That last night he did attack Liz Truss on the BBC debate stage, but it had to be dragged out of him. And this scandal is not going away. Indeed, it could get worse. It's going to make Rishi Sunak's job of differentiating himself all the harder.
Final word then on Labour's campaign, because it seems the feeling you get is a lot of Tories are sort of throwing in the towel. Is it making it easy for Labour to sort of set out what they might do in government in just 2 weeks?
Yes, it is, although you won't get much complacency or indeed forthcoming statements from Labour on their fiscal plans or anything else. But actually, the lack of any pressure from the Conservative campaign just means Keir Starmer is quite happy to get through every day without making a colossal mistake. He didn't do that on the debate stage yesterday, even if his decision to say Jeremy Corbyn would have been a better Prime Minister than Boris Johnson did raise eyebrows in his office. I think the Labour Party are quite content to just try and sit this one out for as long as possible.
Patrick Maguire, thank you very much for joining us. And Patrick's column in today's Times makes for very interesting reading as ever. Now, which party is better for business as we head towards the general election? Yesterday, Chancellor Jeremy Hunt and his Labour counterpart Rachel Reeves were here in this very building pitching for power at the Times CEO Summit. Reeves insisted Labour is the pro-business party, while Hunt insisted the difference between him and his rival comes down to tax. Well, let's speak now to the former Chief Executive Officer of Marks & Spencer, current Chair of ASDA, Conservative peer Lord Stuart Rose. Good afternoon, Stuart.
Cathy, good afternoon.
Well, I wondered what your take was first on the question of business, because, Rishi Sunak and his Chancellor have undoubtedly steadied the ship. Inflation is down, but the economy is still stagnating. So does Rachel Reeves's vision of a sort of growth agenda, does it convince you?
Well, I think anybody's vision of a growth agenda is what we need, Cathy. But if I could just step back a little bit, for me, this is the most important election since 1979, since Maggie Thatcher came into power, when the country was facing some of the very same problems as we're facing today. So I can only reiterate, first of all, is how important it is for people to go out and vote. Do not sit on your backsides. Don't sit there with your arms crossed and saying it's somebody else's problem. Go and vote. Interrogate both serious parties, i.e. those parties who are going to be in power, either the Labour Party or the Conservative Party, and say, who do you believe is going to actually deliver? And when you've made that decision, then vote accordingly.
Does that imply that you're sceptical that Labour will deliver on its growth plan?
No, I'm not sceptical, but I am inquisitive to know, because we're still 13 days away from election day. And obviously you can see why, but they have been pretty sparse in the sort of information they've given out about what we can expect. Now, you ask what business wants. Business, first and foremost, wants a clear runway. It wants stability. It wants to know where it's going to be over the next 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, because we need investment, and investment will drive growth. So if we can get that clarity of purpose from the parties on knowing where we're going, but on particularly things like taxation, and I don't just mean personal taxation, I mean corporate taxation, and I mean in sort of reliefs and benefits we're going to get from making the right investment decisions.
Are you impressed by what you've heard from Rachel Reeves about her sort of idea of a partnership between the private sector, inviting that investment that you talk about, in partnership with the public sector and the government?
Well, as a businessman who's been in business a long time, I'm embarrassed to say I've been around for 53 years in business and I'm still at it. Business has actually been held in pretty low esteem since the financial crisis. If you remember, bankers got demonized. After bankers got demonized, business got demonized. And we really haven't seen any really moving together between politicians and business since then. I mean, and unfortunately, some of the early comments made by the Conservative Party were not helpful. I'm
Well,
pleased to see
Boris Johnson talked about F business, didn't he?
he did. I'm too polite to have used that word, but
Me
I'm glad
too.
you used it before me.
But I mean, do you think they haven't recovered from that? That was a sort of point of no return in some ways for business.
Well, it was a low point. And listen, let's just put things in perspective. We have to look back before we look forward. I mean, I will say this, and I'm quite shocked still that the one word that hasn't been mentioned much during this election is the Brexit word. I think that was the greatest act of national harm that this country's probably done for a century. Okay, nobody wants to talk about it. Labour doesn't want to talk about it because it doesn't want to upset potential voters. Conservatives don't want to talk about it because they did it. But at the end of the day, that's caused us real trouble. Then, unfortunately, and this is an unfortunate consequence, God laughs when man makes plans, or when politicians make plans. We had COVID, and then we've had this terrible crisis with the economy. So you have to say it has been very difficult, but I think we could have lent in, all of us together, to make things better than they are today. So both parties are in a difficult place, because how do you get growth? You have to get growth by investment. How do you invest? You have to spend money, and you can't spend money because they're constrained by the balance sheet in the UK.
We've seen various Tory donors and supporters sort of peeling off and backing Labour. Given you were talking about Brexit there, Labour talks about wanting a closer relationship with our biggest trading partner on our doorsteps, Europe. Is that enough to convince you perhaps to cross the floor or not?
I secretly believe they want it, but of course they're too scared to say it. And for God's sake, let's just wake up to the fact that our economy has not moved forward in the way we believed it might. For some extraneous reasons, I understand, but we should be getting closer to our closest trading partner. And I think it's a mistake not to just fess up and say we can actually come to a point where we're a bit closer in a different way.
Stand back for a minute. And I was putting this to Patrick just a second ago. You had Rishi Sunak standing on the steps of Downing Street in the pouring rain, launching this campaign. He then came home early from D-Day, and there was a huge row about that. Now there's this betting scandal. If the Conservative Party that you support was a business, what would you be saying as chief exec to the board and shareholders about the kind of performance you've seen in the last few weeks?
Well, if 3/4 of the people who have been politicians in the last 10 years have done what they've done as public limited company directors, they'd be out in their ear. They might even be prosecuted. We would not be in our jobs.
Would Rishi Sunak be sacked for having run the campaign he's run?
No, poor old Rishi Sunak. I've never met him. I think actually he's a very decent man. I think he's got the most awful, act to fill. He has inherited a terrible, terrible, terrible bag load of stuff, and I think he's a decent man trying to do a decent job. Well, whether it's enough and whether people will cut him enough slack, I don't know, but I do actually feel for him. Some of his predecessors, I cannot say the same about.
But I mean, has he got what it takes to be a politician? He might be a decent man, but is he? Does he feel politics in the way he needs to?
Well, you have to ask the question the other way. Are you inspired by what's the alternative?
Well, are you?
Well, I must say I was a little bit surprised last night to hear, the defence of Corbyn by Keir Starmer, or not the defence so much, but he didn't actually disown it, and then to start saying, well, Boris Johnson was worse than Corbyn might have been. Why not just say, look, I did a mistake, I made a mistake, I supported the wrong man, I made a mistake, let's move on. I do have this problem with politicians who can't actually say, I was wrong, I misjudged it. Now, at least you have to say about Sunak, he did say he was wrong about Normandy. That was an fortunate thing. He shouldn't have done it, but he said sorry. He did say, yes, you're right about the queues in the National Health Service. They have gone up before they've gone down again. He did say that he hasn't got some other things right. So let's have a little bit of honesty around. Now, I'm just saying to the public, when I say please vote, think look and ask yourself, you have now got to go through the next 5 years, and actually that's going to be very important 5 years.
You can't vote as a peer, but if you were, it sounds like you would still be reluctantly backing the Tories, whatever.
Listen, I'm a conservative. I believe in conservative value. I'm a centrist. I actually don't believe it. I don't like some of the right-wing tendencies the party's now showing. I don't like what the opportunity might present for some people to vote reform. I do believe, though, in free markets. I do believe in low taxation. I do believe that people should be rewarded for hard work. I do believe people should have the right to be able to live their lives. I am a bit upset is probably a good word to use about the fact that I, for some reason, because I'm a certain age and I'm still working, that I'm not regarded as a working person. Because the implication is because I'm a working person and I've got a little bit of leather on my shoes, I'm going to get taxed higher. But why not say so?
All right. Well, you talked there about the sort of the word you used, I think, was centrist. But how important is it, do you think, that the next Conservative leader, because people are already jostling for leadership, how important is it that that person is a one nation, compassionate Conservative? Words you've used very recently.
I think it's vitally important, but I'm not hopeful that will emerge in short order if the Conservatives don't win this election and they then go to another leadership. Listen, we've had 5 leaders that would have been in 5 years.
Kemi Badenoch, does she impress you, or too right wing?
Well, she said in the paper this morning on some article I read that there's nothing much left about her. If she meant left or left, I'm not sure. But if it's
either way, you're not convinced.
Well, I know. I'm afraid I don't sit on the right of the party. I'm not a party member, but I do not sit there. I am very much a compassionate conservative. I hope that's a phrase that's not too old-fashioned. I think that's what conservatism has stood for a long time. I think that's what the British public believe in.
So if Nigel Farage ended up as leader of the party, you couldn't still sit on the Tory benches then?
I would leave the country.
Really? Right. Okay. But if it's someone from the right, short of Nigel Farage, you'll try and rebuild and make it work.
Well, listen, I'm not a fully paid up supporter of the Conservative Party. You know, if you look, I have had difficulties in supporting some of the policies that the party's put forward in the last year or two. It has been a difficult one for me to swallow. But at the end of the day, yet I haven't passed the point of no return.
Well, just finally on that point then, Sir Jim Ratcliffe, who's the chemicals tycoon who was at the Times CEO summit just yesterday, he said it was time for a change, saying that Sir Keir Starmer was, and I quote, a straightforward, decent man. Do you agree with that sentiment?
I honestly can't answer the question because I don't know. I've never met Keir Starmer, but I'm slightly sceptical about what Jim Ratcliffe might say because he was a fully paid up Brexiteer.
Okay. Well, Lord Stuart Rose, thank you very much for coming on the programme. Always great to hear from you.